Prudence Thorne had long ago mastered the quiet art of rendering herself invisible. It was a skill honed in the drafty corridors of Thorne Hall, a way of standing so still against the mahogany paneling that the world simply flowed around her like water around a rooted stone. On this 7th day after her father's funeral, as the rain streaked against the tall library windows in grey weeping ribbons, that invisibility felt less like a shield and more like a shroud. The room smelled of wet wool, dying embers, and the sour, metallic scent of old ink. Mr. Penhaligon, the family solicitor, sat behind the heavy oak desk, his spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of a nose that seemed to have been sharpened by decades of reading fine print. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and rasping, like parchment being folded in a quiet room. Lydia Thorne sat in the velvet armchair directly across from him, her morning sarcenet rustling with every impatient breath. She was the eldest, a woman whose beauty was a weapon she kept polished and ready, her eyes already surveying the library, as if calculating the value of the leather-bound volumes by the inch. Beside her, Beatrice Thorne leaned back with a faint, bored sigh, her fingers tracing the lace of her handkerchief. They were the victors of this day, and they knew it. They had spent the week following the burial, already dividing the linens and the silver in their minds, their voices hushed not in grief, but in consultation. Prudence stood near the shadow of the tall clock, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her own black dress, a simple, well-mended thing that had belonged to their mother, Marguerite Thorne, years before. The reading of the will was a clinical affair, a steady rhythm of legalities that stripped the world of its sentiment. Mr. Penhaligon spoke of entails and annuities, his voice, a monotonous drone that nonetheless carried the weight of a guillotine. Lydia was granted the hall, the primary estate, and the lion's share of the Thorne family fortune, a sum that would ensure her place in the upper echelons of the county for a lifetime. Beatrice was settled with the London townhouse and a generous portion of the remaining consols, enough to provide a dowry that would tempt even a nobleman's younger son. As each paragraph was read, the sisters grew taller, their shoulders straightening under the weight of their new power. They did not look at Prudence once. They did not need to. In their eyes, she was merely another piece of furniture to be disposed of, an inconvenient relic of a father who had been too tired to properly consider his youngest child. It was only when the fire had burned down to a dull orange glow that Mr. Penhaligon reached the final codicil. He paused, his gaze flickering toward Prudence for a fleeting second before returning to the document. It was a look of professional pity, the kind of expression one might give a creature that had outlived its usefulness. He adjusted his papers, the sound of the parchment loud in the sudden, expectant silence. He read the words slowly, as if to ensure there could be no misunderstanding. To Prudence Thorne, the youngest daughter, was left the parcel of land known as Willow Cottage on the far eastern border of the Oakhaven estate, along with all standing structures in their current state, and a small, fixed annuity that would barely cover the cost of basic sustenance for a year. A sharp, mocking titter escaped Beatrice's lips, a sound that cut through the atmospheric stillness of the library like a shard of glass. Willow Cottage was a ruin, a derelict labourer's dwelling that had not seen a fire in its hearth since the turn of the century. It was a place of damp stone and rotted thatch, a calculated insult disguised as a legacy. Lydia did not laugh. She simply turned her head slightly, her gaze cold and clinical as it landed on Prudence. It was not that she was unkind, but that she had forgotten how to see her sister as anything other than a burden to be discarded. The silence that followed was heavy with a coldness that seeped into the very marrow of the house and threatened to shatter the foundations of Prudence's composure. Mr. Penhaligon closed the folder with a definitive snap, the sound echoing like a finality in the cavernous room. He did not offer his hand to Prudence. He knew where the power resided now, and his loyalty, governed by the strict laws of the peerage and the ledger, followed the gold. He gathered his belongings, his movements precise and practiced, and bowed low to Lydia. Prudence watched them, her heart a heavy, leaden weight in her chest. She thought of her mother, Marguerite Thorne, and the way she had once sat in this very library, her hands busy with bookbinding tools, her eyes full of a quiet, hidden wisdom. Marguerite had died when Prudence was but a girl, leaving behind a house full of voices that never spoke her name with love. Now, even the walls of that house were being taken from her. The transition from the library to the grand entrance hall was a blur of rustling silk and the echoing clicks of boots on marble. The sisters moved with a new predatory grace, their ownership manifesting in the way they directed the bewildered servants. Lydia stood at the base of the great staircase, the light from the chandelier reflecting in the dark, cold depths of her eyes. She watched as a footman brought Prudence's single, battered trunk from the upper floors. A small wooden thing that looked pathetic against the backdrop of the Thorne family grandeur. There was no farewell prepared, no lingering embrace of sisters who had shared a childhood. There was only the clinical observation of a transaction being finalized. As Prudence reached for her cloak, Lydia stepped forward, her hand moving with sudden, calculated speed. She did not reach for Prudence's hand, but for the thin gold chain that hung around her neck. It was a simple locket, the only thing Prudence possessed that had belonged to their mother. A small, oval piece of gold with a lock of Marguerite's hair preserved behind a sliver of crystal. Lydia's fingers were cold as they brushed against Prudence's skin, a tactile reminder of the social shaming that was about to commence. With a sharp, practiced tug, the delicate clasp gave way. Lydia held the locket up to the light, her lips curling into a thin, triumphant line that lacked even a trace of sisterly mercy. "Everything within these walls is now mine, Prudence," Lydia murmured, her voice a low, dangerous silk that carried through the hall. "This is a family heirloom, a piece of the Thorne legacy, and it shall remain where it belongs, with the mistress of the house. You have your cottage and your pittance. You will find no more charity here." Lydia did not wait for a response, nor did she care for the flash of grief that crossed Prudence's face. She turned on her heel and handed the locket to Beatrice, who took it with a smirk of practiced cruelty. It was a physical manifestation of the disinheritance, a final stripping of Prudence's identity before she was cast out into the grey world beyond the gates. Prudence felt the loss of the metal's weight against her chest like a fresh wound. She did not cry. The time for tears had passed in the long nights, spent nursing a father who had forgotten her name, even as she wiped the sweat from his brow. She simply pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, the damp wool smelling of cedar and neglect. She looked at the sisters she had once played with in the gardens, seeing only strangers, wrapped in the expensive armor of their greed. They stood like sentinels of a fortress she was no longer allowed to enter, their silence a wall that no plea could breach. She understood then that the architecture of her life at Thorne Hall had been dismantled, and all that remained was the labor of survival. The heavy front doors were opened by a footman who looked everywhere but at her face. The air that rushed in was thick with the scent of rain and the sodden earth of autumn, a sharp contrast to the stale, perfumed air of the manor. Beyond the gravel drive, the world was a blur of mist and shadow, the trees of the estate standing like skeletal guardians of a past she had to leave behind. Prudence stepped out onto the portico, the wind catching the hem of her dress. She did not look back. She knew that if she did, the sight of the sisters watching from the warmth of the hall would break the fragile resolve she had built within the quietude of her own heart. A small, open cart waited for her at the base of the steps, driven by a man who looked as weathered and grey as the stone walls of the dower house. He did not speak as he helped her settle her trunk into the back, his movements slow and methodical. This was her exile, a journey to a ruin that her sisters intended to be her final resting place. As the cart began to move, the wheels crunching over the wet gravel, Prudence looked down at her hands. They were small, seemingly delicate, but they possessed a strength born of years of quiet manual tasks, the mending of books, the balancing of ledgers for a father who had lost his grip on numbers, the precise stitching of linens. She thought of Willow Cottage, a place she had only seen from a distance during her childhood walks. It was a place where the world had stopped, where the moss and the ivy had reclaimed the work of men. To anyone else, it was a sentence of penury, a wasteland of rot and damp. But as the silhouette of Thorne Hall faded into the mist behind her, Prudence felt a strange, flickering spark of fierce resilience. They had taken the house, the money, and the gold from her neck, but they had not taken the competence that lived in her fingers, or the heritage that lived in her mind. She would go to the ruin and find the true foundation of the place. She would attend to the slow, deep currents of the land rather than the clamor of the world, and in the silence of her new life, she would learn the true value of what had been hidden. The rain began to fall in earnest now, soaking through her cloak and chilling her skin, but Prudence did not shiver. She watched the road ahead, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, where the trees of the Oakhaven estate borders stood in silent witness. She was 20 and penniless, cast out by her own blood into a house that was a calculated insult. But as the cart turned onto the muddy track that led away from the grandeur of her past, she knew that she was no longer merely a shadow in a room full of light. She was a woman with a ruin to mend, and in the restoration of that broken place, she would find the lifeline that had been unpromised in the quiet, faded margins of her mother's old books. The familiar invisibility that had defined her existence was fracturing, and for the first time, Prudence was looking toward a future that was entirely and terrifyingly her own. The cart rattled away, the sound of iron-rimmed wheels on the muddy track fading into the damp, heavy silence of the Oakhaven woods. The young woman stood alone before the skeletal remains of Willow Cottage, her single wooden trunk sitting in the tall, sodden grass like a small coffin. The air here was different from the manicured gardens of Thorne Hall. It was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, ancient moss, and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. Before her, the structure did not so much stand as lean against the encroaching forest, a ruin of grey limestone and rotted thatch that seemed to be surrendering to the earth. The ivy had grown so thick over the southern wall that it looked like a shroud of dark, suffocating velvet, its tendrils prying at the mortar with the slow, patient strength of time itself. She did not move for a long moment, allowing the exact temperature of the silence to settle against her skin. It was a coldness that did not merely sit on the surface, but seemed to recognize the hollowness within her chest. Lydia and Beatrice had intended for this place to be a mirror of her worth, a discarded, broken thing, stripped of beauty and utility. They had laughed at the thought of her standing here, in her thin cloak and mended boots, facing the winter in a house that lacked even the dignity of a solid door. But as Prudence looked at the sagging lintel and the windows that stared back like hollow eyes, she felt a strange grounding pull in her marrow. This ruin was hers. For the first time in 20 years, no one would watch her from the shadows of a grand hallway. No one would calculate the cost of her existence in the margins of a family ledger. She stepped forward, the wet grass clutching at the hem of her sarcenet skirts. The front door did not require a key. It hung on a single, rusted hinge, groaning with a high, mournful pitch as she pushed it aside. The interior of the cottage was a cavern of grey light and the smell of stagnant air and wet plaster. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that managed to pierce through the grime-streaked panes. The floor was a mosaic of grit and dried leaves, yet as she moved into the center of the main room, her eyes found the underlying strength of the architecture. The hearth was wide, built of massive, soot-stained stones that had survived the partial collapse of the upper floor. The rafters, though greyed by age, were made of solid oak, their structural integrity still evident beneath the layers of neglect. Prudence set her trunk down near the fireplace, the sound echoing through the empty rooms with a finality that made her breath hitch. She began a slow, methodical circuit of her new domain, her hands trailing over the rough surfaces of the walls. In the corner of the small kitchen, atop a shelf that had miraculously remained level, sat a single object that the looters and the years had overlooked. It was a porcelain vase, its surface covered in a delicate pattern of faded blue willow branches. A jagged crack ran down its side, and the rim was chipped, making it worthless to anyone seeking a profit. To Lydia, it would have been rubbish. To Beatrice, a nuisance to be swept away. Prudence reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, gritty ceramic. As she lifted the vessel, something shifted inside, a dry, rustling sound that did not belong to the dust. She reached into the depths of the vase and pulled out a small, folded scrap of parchment. The paper was yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of the cedar chest where her mother had once kept her private things. The handwriting on the outside was unmistakable. It was the elegant, disciplined script of Marguerite Thorne, a hand that Prudence had studied for hours in the margins of old bookbinding manuals. She unfolded the note with trembling fingers, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The message was brief, written in a moment of foresight that sent a chill through Prudence's soul. "To my Prudence," the note began, the ink faded but legible. "I have watched the shadows grow in the hearts of your sisters, and I know the path they will choose when the light of your father's house fades. They seek the gold that glitters and the titles that flatter, but greed is a hollow house that eventually consumes its inhabitants. Do not mourn the grandeur you have lost, for it was a cage of sarcenet and silence. Look to the foundations of this place, my daughter. The earth does not lie, and the legacy I have laid for you is deeper than any vault in Thorne Hall. Seek the lifeline I have hidden where the hearth meets the heart. They will come for what they think is yours, but they will find only the weight of their own undoing. Prudence clutched the paper to her chest, her eyes stinging with a sudden sharp grief. Her mother had known. Marguerite had sat in the quiet of the library, mending the spines of books while the world ignored her, and she had seen the trajectory of her daughter's cruelty. She had prepared this ruin as a sanctuary, a place where the smallest child could become the cornerstone. The word lifeline echoed in Prudence's mind, a promise that the poverty she faced was not an end, but a beginning. She looked down at the floorboards near the hearth, the limestone slabs heavy and indifferent. The foundational truth was not just in the walls and the roof, but in a legacy of quiet resilience that her sisters could never understand. The sky beyond the window had turned the color of a bruised plum, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to drum against the rotted thatch. It was not a gentle autumn shower, but a torrential downpour, the kind that moved with the weight of a physical assault. Within minutes, the cottage was filled with the sound of the elements. Water began to seep through the ceiling, dripping with a rhythmic, maddening persistence onto the dusty floor. Prudence moved with the frantic precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime anticipating disaster. She dragged her trunk to the driest corner, beneath the one section of the upper floor that remained intact, and began to gather the few copper pans she had brought to catch the leaking water. The storm intensified, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls until the very air seemed to vibrate. A sudden, terrifying groan echoed from above, the sound of wood yielding to the pressure of the saturated thatch. Prudence looked up just as a section of the plaster ceiling gave way, collapsing in a heap of grey rubble and sodden lath. The rain poured through the opening, a cold, relentless curtain that threatened to drown the tiny fire she had managed to spark in the hearth. She grabbed a heavy wooden board that had been leaning against the wall and tried to wedge it against the sagging beam, her muscles straining, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The grit of the plaster got into her eyes and mouth, but she did not stop. She could not let the ruin claim her before she had even begun to mend it. Through the roar of the wind and the lashing of the rain, the sound of rhythmic thuds reached her ears, the heavy, purposeful strike of hooves on sodden earth. Prudence froze, her hands still braced against the beam. A shadow appeared in the doorway, blocking out the jagged flashes of lightning. It was a man on horseback, a silhouette of immense, brooding power wrapped in a heavy, sodden greatcoat. He dismounted with a grace that spoke of a life lived in the saddle, his boots splashing into the mud of the threshold. He stepped into the cottage, the light from the dying fire catching the sharp, angular planes of a face that was both beautiful and burdened. This was Silas Vane, the Lord of Oakhaven, a man the villagers whispered of in hushed, fearful tones. He was the scarred recluse, a nobleman who had retreated from the ballrooms of London to the solitude of his vast estate after a tragedy that no one dared name. His eyes, a dark and piercing grey, swept over the devastation of the cottage before landing on Prudence. He stood in the center of the ruin, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his presence filling the small space until the walls seemed to shrink. "You are Prudence Thorne," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried over the storm. It was not a question but a statement of fact delivered with the clinical observation of a man used to assessing the state of his lands. "The solicitor informed me of your arrival. He did not, however, mention that you were being sent to a grave." Prudence did not lower her arms, though her shoulders burned with the effort of holding the beam. She looked at him through the curtain of rain and dust, her jaw set in a line of fierce, quiet defiance. "It is not a grave, Lord Silas," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "It is a house. It requires labor, not a priest." Lord Silas stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the way she braced herself against the collapsing roof. He saw the calluses on her hands, the dirt smudged across her cheek, and the absolute lack of flattery in her eyes. "Oakhaven is less than a mile through the woods," he said, his tone shifting to something more urgent. "The roof will not hold another hour in this deluge. I have rooms that are dry and a fire that does not struggle for breath. You will come with me, madam. You cannot fight the sky with a piece of rotted timber." Prudence looked at the door, then back at the hearth where her mother's note lay safely tucked inside her bodice. The offer was a sanctuary, a protective gesture from the most powerful man in the county. To accept would be the sensible choice, the act of a woman who knew the value of her own safety. But as she looked at the Lord, she saw more than just a benefactor. She saw the social world she had just escaped, the world of obligations, of being seen through the lens of pity and status. If she left now, she would be admitting that Lydia was right. She would be a beggar in silk, forever indebted to the mercy of a stranger. "I thank you for your charity, your lordship," Prudence said, her voice dropping to a level of restrained elegance that seemed to startle him. "But this cottage was left to me in perpetuity. If I am to mend my life, I must start with the restoration of the house I was given. I will not seek shelter in a manor when my own roof is weeping. I have work to do." Lord Silas stared at her, his dark brows drawing together in a look of profound, silent observation. He was a man who had spent years observing the undercurrents of a person rather than their surface motions, and he recognized the particular temperature of her resolve. It was not the loud, undignified stubbornness of the proud, but the quiet, immovable resilience of the competent. He reached out, his hand hovering near the beam she held, but he did not take it from her. Instead, he simply adjusted his stance, his gaze searching hers for a long, heavy moment. "The Thorne sisters spoke of you as a shadow," Silas murmured, the subtext of his words speaking of a growing, quiet respect. They were mistaken. Shadows do not hold up falling houses. He turned then, his cloak billowing behind him as he stepped back into the storm. He did not offer a second plea. He understood that some things must be built in the dark, and that the labor of restoration was a private, sacred struggle. "I shall return when the sun finds the rubble. Prudence Thorne, do not let the rain extinguish your fire." He was gone as quickly as he had appeared, the sound of his horse's hooves swallowed by the roar of the wind. Prudence remained standing in the center of her ruin, her muscles screaming, her breath hitching in her throat. She was 20 when penniless, and the roof was falling around her. But as she braced herself against the weight of the oak, she felt the paper against her heart, the lifeline hidden by a mother who had known that true value was found not in what was given, but in what was mended. She leaned into the task, her hands finding the strength they had been practicing for a lifetime, while the storm raged on in the darkness outside. The dawn did not break over the Oakhaven valley so much as it bled through the mist in a series of bruised, watery greys. Prudence awoke on the floor of Willow Cottage, her body a map of new and sharp aches where the cold of the limestone had seeped through her thin palate. The air inside the main room was heavy, with the smell of damp plaster and the lingering, metallic scent of the storm. Above her, the temporary brace she had hammered into place during the night held firm, a crude but functional monument to her own survival. She was 20 and penniless, her sisters having stripped her of every velvet comfort and gold-linked memory. But as she stood and smoothed her wrinkled sarsenet skirts, she felt the weight of her mother's note against her skin. It was not a fortune, not yet, but it was a direction. To restore the house, one first had to sustain the body, and the small annuity Mr. Penhaligon had mentioned would not arrive for months. She needed the dignity of labor. The village of Oakhaven lay 3 miles to the south, a cluster of honey-colored stone cottages that seemed to huddle together for warmth against the encroaching woods. Prudence walked the distance in the biting morning air, her breath blooming in white plumes, her eyes fixed on the rising steam of the communal laundry. It was a place where the social hierarchies of the county were boiled down to the basic necessity of cleanliness, a humid cavern where the finery of the great houses met the lie-scarred hands of the invisible. The smell hit her before she reached the door, a thick, suffocating mixture of wood smoke, boiling soap, and the sour, damp scent of soiled linen. Inside, the heat was a physical weight. Tabitha Higgins, the housekeeper of the Oakhaven dower house and the unofficial matriarch of the village's working women, stood over a massive copper cauldron. She was a woman built of straight lines and hard edges, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like weathered oak. She did not look up as Prudence approached, her movements rhythmic and relentless as she stirred the steaming vat with a heavy wooden paddle. The exact temperature of the room was somewhere between a fever and a forge, and for a moment, the refined daughter of Thorne Hall felt the familiar urge to retreat into the shadows of her own invisibility. "I am seeking work, Mrs. Higgins," Prudence said, her voice small against the roar of the fire and the rhythmic slapping of wet cloth against the scrubbing boards. She did not lead with her name or her pedigree. She stood in her mended boots and offered the only thing she had left, the strength in her hands. Tabitha Higgins stopped her stirring then, leaning her weight against the paddle as she turned her piercing, walnut-colored eyes on Prudence. She surveyed the girl from the frayed hem of her cloak to the precise disciplined bun at the nape of her neck. There was no pity in that gaze, only the clinical assessment of a woman who had seen 1,000 tragedies and survived them all by refusing to blink. "You're the Thorne girl," Tabitha said. her voice a dry rasp that seemed to cut through the steam. "The one they sent to the ruin. Your sisters passed through the village yesterday in a carriage that cost more than this laundry. They didn't look like women who had a sister living in the mud." "They are the mistresses of Thorne Hall now," Prudence replied, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. "I am the mistress of Willow Cottage, and the cottage requires bread." Mrs. Higgins let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so devoid of mirth. She gestured toward a low wooden bench where a mountain of heavy stained table linens lay waiting. "Pride is a stubborn stain, Prudence Thorne. It doesn't come out with a gentle rinse. If you want the coin, you'll start there. The lie will bite your skin and the steam will steal your breath, but it will teach you the unyielding marrow of the work. You'll learn to scrub until the water runs clear, or you'll leave before the sun sets. There's no room for shadows here." The hours that followed were a grueling initiation into the reality of manual labor. Prudence knelt at the scrubbing board until her knees felt like they were ground into the stone floor. The lye-heavy soap turned her fingers raw and red, the skin puckering and stinging with every pass over the coarse fabric. She learned the physics of the task, how to use the weight of her shoulders rather than the strength of her wrists, how to find the grain of the linen and work against the grease and the wine. It was a different kind of competence from the delicate mending of books or the balancing of ledgers, but as the grime of the great houses dissolved in her tub, she felt a strange cleansing clarity. Each stain she removed felt like a small victory over the social shaming Lydia had intended for her. Tabitha Higgins watched her from the corner of her eye, her own movements never faltering. As the afternoon light began to turn a pale, dusty amber through the high, steam-fogged windows, the older woman moved to Prudence's side, dropping a fresh pile of linens onto the bench. "Your mother was a bookbinder's daughter before she married into the Thorne name," Tabitha murmured, her voice lowered so the other women could not hear. She knew the value of a clean margin and a solid spine. She used to come here years ago when the hall was full of guests and the laundry was too much for the housemaids. She never acted like a woman who forgot the smell of soap. Prudence paused, her hands submerged in the grey, soapy water. "She never spoke of it. She didn't need to," Tabitha replied, her gaze softening for the briefest of seconds. She knew that the Thorne wealth was built on sand and secrets. Your father was a man who loved the appearance of things, but Marguerite, she saw the rot beneath the floorboards long before the storm came. She told me once that she was raising one daughter to survive the truth and two to perish in the lie. I see she wasn't mistaken. The revelation sat heavy in Prudence's mind, a new piece of the map her mother had left behind. Marguerite had not merely predicted the sisters' cruelty, she had prepared for it, weaving a legacy of labor and resilience into the very fabric of Prudence's upbringing. The work at the laundry was not just a means of survival. It was a continuation of a hidden history, a way of reclaiming a heritage that Lydia and Beatrice could never touch because they were too busy admiring the gold on the surface. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the heavy timber door of the laundry groaned open, admitting a gust of cold, evening air that sent the steam swirling in frantic patterns. The women fell silent, their hands slowing as a figure stepped into the humid yellow light. Lord Silas Vane stood in the threshold, his height making the low-beamed room feel even smaller, his greatcoat still smelling of the damp woods and pine. He looked entirely out of place amidst the copper vats and scrubbing boards, a man of cold stone and ancient titles standing in the heart of the village's sweat and toil. He did not look at the other women. His grey, searching gaze found Prudence where she knelt by her tub. He approached her with a slow, deliberate pace, his boots clicking softly on the wet stone. In his hand he carried a small bundle wrapped in a scrap of fine, dark silk. He stood before her for a long moment, the silence between them thick with the unsaid things of the previous night. "I found this in the library at Oakhaven," Silas said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the humid air. He unwrapped the silk to reveal a small, silver-bound miniature frame. The silver was tarnished to a dull, bruised black, and the delicate filigree was crushed on one side, the glass missing, the portrait within long since lost to dampness. "It belonged to my mother. It is the only image of her that survived the fire, and it has been broken since I was a boy. The jewelers in London said it was too fragile to mend, that the metal would snap if pressed. But I remembered the way you held that beam last night. I remembered your hands." Prudence dried her raw, red fingers on her apron, her movements precise and restrained. She took the frame from him, her touch light and analytical. She saw the exact point of the fracture, the way the silver had been stressed by heat and time. It was a technical challenge that required the steady hand of a binder and the patience of a restorer. "It can be mended, Lord Silas," she murmured, her thumb tracing the broken filigree. "But it will require a slow fire and a gentle hand. It cannot be rushed." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable, though there was a tension in the set of his shoulders that spoke of a hidden, heavy burden. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was intended only for her ears. "My sisters-in-law and the executors are pressing me, Prudence. The estate's debts are a ledger of failures I did not write. They insist that the only way to save Oakhaven is through a union with the Thorne fortune. They have already begun the invitations for your sisters, Lydia or Beatrice, they do not care which, so long as the gold flows into the Vane coffers." The weight of the silver frame felt suddenly immense in Prudence's hand. The situational irony was a cold draught in the heated room. The man who had offered her sanctuary was being forced into the arms of the women who had cast her out. Silas, the powerful recluse, was as much a prisoner of his heritage as she was a victim of hers. "They seek a title to match their gold," Prudence said, her gaze meeting his with a startling honesty. "They will not care for the man, only the crown he wears. If you marry one of them, you will find that Oakhaven is no longer yours, but a ballroom for their vanity." "I know," Silas replied, his eyes dark with a grief that he no longer tried to hide from her. "They see a scarred man with a crumbling estate. They do not see the bones of the thing. But as I watched you today through the window, I saw a woman who chose the lie over the lie. I find I cannot easily return to the company of those who would buy a name they do not respect." He reached out, his calloused hand hovering near hers, a gesture of protective kindness that he did not complete. The romantic tension between them was a slow burn, built not on flattery or the dance, but on the shared silence of two people who had been unseen by the world. "Mend the frame, Prudence Thorne," Silas said, his voice regaining its restrained, noble edge. "Bring it to the dower house when it is finished. And perhaps in the restoration of the broken silver we might find a way to mend more than just a memory." He turned and left as quietly as he had come, the cold air from the doorway lingering long after he had vanished into the mist. Prudence remained at her bench, the silver frame clutched in her hand, the raw sting of the lie forgotten. She looked at Tabitha Higgins, who was watching her with a keen, knowing insight. "Lord Silas has a long memory for those who stand their ground," Tabitha murmured, returning to her cauldron, "and a sharp eye for the truth. You'd best get that linen finished, girl. The sun is down, and the walk to the cottage is long in the dark." Prudence gathered her things, the small silver frame tucked safely into the pocket of her cloak. As she stepped out into the crisp night air, the stars were beginning to pierce through the clearing mist, cold and distant like the diamonds Lydia had stolen. She walked toward the ruin of Willow Cottage, her body exhausted, her hands aching, but her mind was alive with the technical details of the repair. She had spent a lifetime learning the shape of being unseen, but tonight, in the steam of a village laundry and the eyes of a scarred nobleman, she felt the first faint warmth of being truly witnessed. The loudest truths are often found in the quietest ledgers, and as the ink of the day dried on the horizon, Prudence knew that the restoration had truly begun. The silver-bound miniature frame sat in the deep pocket of Prudence's cloak, a small, cold weight that seemed to pulse against her hip as she walked the long, winding road back to Willow Cottage. The night was a vast canvas of charcoal and silver, the moon hanging low and sharp like a sickle over the dark canopy of the Oakhaven woods. Every step was a rhythmic ache, her knees still protesting the hours spent on the laundry's stone floor, and her hands, raw and puckered from the lie, throbbed in the biting air. Yet, as she moved through the shifting shadows, Prudence felt a strange, quiet electrification of her senses. She was no longer merely a ghost haunted by the memory of Thorne Hall. She was a woman carrying a broken piece of a nobleman's history, and in her pocket lay the promise of a restoration that required the very skills her sisters had once mocked as the useless hobbies of a plain girl. The cottage loomed out of the mist, a skeletal silhouette that looked less like a ruin and more like a fortress in the pale light. The silence of the woods was absolute, save for the occasional, distant snap of a dry branch or the mournful call of a night bird. Prudence entered the main room, her breath blooming in the chill, and the smell of damp limestone greeted her like a familiar, if somewhat cold, companion. She set the silver-bound miniature frame on the small, scarred table near the hearth, the metal catching a stray beam of moonlight that filtered through the broken thatch. It was a beautiful, tragic object, a fractured memory of a mother Lord Silas had lost to the flames. She did not touch it yet. She knew that restoration required a stillness of spirit that she had not yet achieved after the heat and noise of the village. She was moving toward the corner to gather a few sticks for a meager fire when the silence of the forest was shattered. It began as a low, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a sound that Prudence recognized from 1,000 afternoons at the hall. It was the heavy, synchronized strike of well-bred carriage horses and the unmistakable metallic jingle of high-end harness brass. The sound grew louder, an intrusive, violent presence in the quiet sanctuary of the dower lands. A moment later, the yellow glow of carriage lamps pierced the mist, casting long, distorted shadows against the trees. A grand barouche, emblazoned with the Thorne crest, swept into the small clearing before the cottage, the iron-rimmed wheels churning the mud with a predatory grace. She stood in the doorway, her hands tucked into her sleeves to hide the lie-burns, her chin lifted in a gesture of restrained elegance. The carriage door was flung open by a footman who looked visibly pained to be treading on such unkempt ground. Lydia stepped out first, her pelisse of deep crimson silk rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She observed the cottage with an expression of such profound distaste that she might have been surveying a festering wound. Behind her, Beatrice emerged, her face obscured by a veil of black lace, her movements languid and bored. They stood in the tall, wet grass like exotic birds trapped in a cage of grey stone, their presence a calculated insult to the very air Prudence breathed. "So it is true," Lydia murmured, her voice a crystalline coldness that seemed to lower the temperature of the clearing. The village gossips spoke of a Thorne girl scrubbing the laundry of commoners, but I did not believe even you could sink to such depths, Prudence. Observe this place. It smells of rot and penury. It is the precise shape of a failure. "It is the house I was given, Lydia," Prudence replied, her voice steady, refusing to allow the tremble in her heart to reach her tongue. "And the labor I perform is my own. I find that the smell of honest soap is far preferable to the scent of stolen jewelry and false grief." Lydia's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger marring the porcelain perfection of her features. She stepped into the threshold of the cottage, her silk skirts sweeping over the grit and dust of the floor. Beatrice followed, her gaze darting around the room with a restless, predatory energy. They did not come for a reconciliation. They came to ensure that the ruin they had sentenced her to was sufficiently miserable. "We did not come to discuss your newfound love for the Sudds, sister," Beatrice said, her voice sharp and impatient. She began to pace the small room, her gloved fingers trailing over the rough stone of the mantel. "We came because the inventory of the hall is incomplete. Mr. Penhaligon is being tedious about the ledgers. He insists that a certain set of Thorne diamonds, the ones Marguerite wore to the Regency ball, were not in the main vault. He seems to think you might have packed them in that pathetic wooden trunk of yours." Prudence felt a sudden, sharp coldness in the pit of her stomach. The Thorne diamonds were legendary, a suite of stones that had been in the family for 3 generations. She had not seen them since her mother's burial, and she had assumed they were locked away in the bank in the capital. "I have nothing but the clothes on my back and the tools of my trade," Prudence said, her gaze fixed on Lydia. "If the diamonds are missing, perhaps you should seek them beneath the floorboards of your own greed. I took nothing but my dignity, though I see you are still trying to find a way to strip me of that as well." Lydia stepped closer, the smell of her expensive French perfume clashing violently with the scent of the damp woods. "Do not play the martyr with me, Prudence. We searched the hall from attic to cellar. Those stones were not there. If they are not found, the solicitors will hold back the final settlement of the consols. We cannot sell the city house until the inventory is cleared." She paused, her eyes scanning the cottage floor with a sudden, intense focus. "Marguerite always favored you. She spent hours in this hovel when we were children, hiding away with her books. If she hid them, she would have told the child who was as invisible as the stones themselves." "She told me nothing of diamonds," Prudence said, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine anxiety in Lydia's eyes. It was a reveal that shifted the power in the room. The victors of Thorne Hall were being humbled by a missing ledger, their grand inheritance stalled by the very silence they had imposed on their mother. Beatrice let out a frustrated huff, her black lace veil fluttering. "It is a waste of time, Lydia. Behold her, she is starving in a ruin. If she had the diamonds, she would have sold them for a roof that did not weep." She turned toward the door, her silk skirts snagging on a loose splinter of the doorframe. "Come, the air in here is making my head ache." Let her rot in her honesty. If the stones are gone, they are gone. We will find another way to settle the debt. Lydia lingered for a moment longer, her gaze falling on the silver frame on the table. She reached out a hand as if to touch it, but Prudence stepped forward, her movement swift and decisive. "That is not yours, Lydia. It is a work of restoration entrusted to me. It has no value to a woman who only counts the weight of the gold." With a final, mocking sneer, Lydia turned and swept out of the cottage, the footman rushing to close the carriage door behind her. The barouche pulled away, the lamps fading into the mist, the sound of the horse's hooves eventually swallowed by the deep, heavy silence of the Oakhaven night. She remained standing in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, the echoes of their voices still ringing in the rafters. They had taken everything, her home, her name, her mother's locket, and yet they were still hungry. They were searching for the diamonds, the physical manifestation of the wealth they believed was their birthright. The rage came then, not as a scream or a sob, but as a cold, focused energy that surged through her raw, lie-burned fingers. She grabbed a heavy scrubbing brush and a bucket of cold water she had drawn from the well earlier that evening. She did not have a fire, and she did not have a lamp, but the moonlight was enough. She dropped to her knees in the center of the room, the same spot where Lydia had stood in her crimson silk, and began to scrub. She scrubbed with a ferocity that defied her exhaustion. She scrubbed the grit from the floorboards, the lye-heavy water stinging her wounds, the rhythmic sound of the bristles against the wood, the only noise in the cottage. She was scrubbing away the stain of her sister's presence, reclaiming the stone and the timber from their mockery. This was the labor of restoration, not just of the house, but of her own soul. She moved methodically, centimeter by centimeter, her hands finding the grain of the ancient oak beneath the layers of neglect. As she reached the area near the hearth, where the heat of many fires had seasoned the wood into a dark iron-hard surface, she noticed something she had missed in the shadows. The moonlight hit a section of the floor at a sharp angle, revealing a pattern in the damp wood that was not a natural grain. Prudence paused, her breath hitching in her throat. She dipped her hand into the bucket and splashed water over the area, the liquid highlighting a faint, circular indentation in the center of a wide board. She leaned closer, her eyes tracing the shape. It was a stylized willow branch, the leaves delicate and precise, mirroring exactly the seal her mother had used on her private letters. It was a mark of ownership, a signature carved into the very bones of the cottage. Prudence felt a surge of adrenaline that made her fingers tremble. She thought of the note in her bodice. "Seek the lifeline I have hidden where the hearth meets the heart." She set the brush aside and used the silver bookbinding awl she had kept in her trunk. She wedged the thin, sharp metal into the seam between the boards, her muscles straining, her mind alive with the technical details of the joinery. The wood was old and stubborn, but she worked with the patience of a woman who knew that the truth was never found on the surface. Slowly, the board began to yield, the sound of a dry, metallic groan echoing through the empty room. Prudence pried the board up, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. Beneath the surface, the space was not filled with the dirt and rubble she had expected. Instead, there was a cavity lined with treated lead, a small, protected void that had remained dry for decades. In the center of the hollow sat the iron-bound casket, a small, heavy box wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas. She reached in and pulled it out, her hands shaking as she unwrapped the layers. The first thing she saw was a flash of cold, brilliant light that seemed to swallow the moonbeams. It was a necklace of such immense beauty and clarity that it seemed to vibrate with its own internal fire. The Thorne diamonds, linked together in a delicate silver setting that mirrored the craftsmanship of a master. But beneath the diamonds lay something even more significant. The royal annuity ledger, a book bound in fine red leather and sealed with the royal crest, its pages crisp and clean despite the years of concealment. Prudence sat on the cold floor, the diamonds spilling over her raw, red hands like frozen tears. The ledger weighed a weight of law and legacy in her lap. Her mother had not just hidden a fortune, she had hidden a lifeline that would rewrite the very architecture of Prudence's world. Lydia and Beatrice had searched the hall for the gold, but they had forgotten that the strongest foundations are often found in the places they considered worthless. The strongest foundations are rarely made of gold, and as the moon climbed higher into the velvet sky, the youngest sister knew that she was no longer the invisible shadow of her father's house. She was the architect of her own restoration. The weight of the silver setting was a tactile shock against her scarred palms, a cold reminder that the artifacts of her mother's past were now the tools of her own future. She sat amidst the dust of Willow Cottage, the royal annuity ledger resting on her knees like a sacred text. The red leather was supple, smelling of cedar and old parchment, its gold embossing catching the meager light of the guttering candle. Beside it, the Thorne diamonds lay scattered on a piece of rough canvas, a cascade of frozen fire that seemed to swallow the shadows of the ruin. These stones, which Lydia and Beatrice had hunted with the frantic greed of looters, cast sharp prisms of cold, blue light across the rough floorboards, a silent legacy Marguerite Thorne had cultivated to protect her most resilient child. Prudence traced the elegant, disciplined script of the Crown's accountants within the ledger. It was not a promise of charity, but a record of irrevocable law. Her mother had used a secret settlement from her own father's bookbinding guild connections to establish an annuity in perpetuity, settled solely upon the daughter, who had been taught to see the value in labor. As she turned the final page, the secret deed slipped from the vellum, a document bearing the heavy wax seal of the High Court. It revealed a truth more potent than the diamonds. The land of Thorne Hall was subject to an ancient covenant, and the ownership of the manor was legally tethered to the occupancy and stewardship of Willow Cottage. By casting Prudence out to this worthless parcel, her sisters had unwittingly surrendered the foundation of their own status. A fortnight passed in a blur of solitary, rhythmic toil. Prudence mended the sagging rafters with the same precision she had once applied to the spines of rare books, her silver bookbinding awl serving as a needle for the house's wounded bones. The cottage began to breathe again, the scent of damp rot replaced by the sharp, clean aroma of beeswax and lye. She was scrubbing the front step, her hands raw but her spirit steady, when the peace of the Oakhaven woods was shattered by the rhythmic clatter of a fine carriage. The vehicle gleamed with polished black lacquer, its wheels churning the damp earth into deep ruts. Lydia and Beatrice stepped out into the muddy yard, their silk dresses rustling like dry leaves against the damp air. Lydia wore a gown of lavender sarcenet, the fine fabric a jarring contrast to the grey limestone of the cottage. She picked her way across the yard with a sneer of profound contempt, her chin tilted at an angle that spoke of a borrowed authority. "This farce ends today, Prudence," Lydia announced, her voice cutting through the morning mist like a blade. "We have sold this parcel of land to a timber merchant to settle the estate's gambling debts. You will gather your rags and be gone by nightfall. The woods have a way of reclaiming what is useless, and we have no further patience for your posturing." Beatrice laughed, a hollow, high-pitched sound that lacked any true mirth. She fanned herself despite the chill, her eyes darting over the mended door and the cleared path with a flicker of annoyance. "You look more like a common charwoman every day, sister. Perhaps the merchant will find a use for you in the laundry, provided you can learn to keep your mouth shut and your head down." Prudence did not rise from her knees immediately. She finished the stroke of her brush, the sound of wood on stone, a steady heartbeat in the silence. When she finally stood, she felt the weight of the secret documents tucked into her bodice, a silent armor against their cruelty. "You cannot sell what is not yours to dispose of, Lydia," Prudence replied quietly. Her voice was a low, resonant silk that carried a new authority. "The hall is a house of cards, and you have spent the last 14 days blowing at the base. I suggest you return to your packing." Lydia's face flushed a deep, angry red, the color of a bruised plum. "The hall is ours by right of birth. This ruin is a mere attachment, a discarded scrap of our father's map. We have the solicitors coming to Oakhaven tomorrow to finalize the seizure and the sale." "Then let us meet them there," Prudence said, her gaze meeting her sister's eyes with a terrifying clarity. "I believe there are certain structural realities regarding this inheritance that Mr. Penhaligon has yet to see. I shall be at his office at 10 o'clock. Do try not to be late. The law, unlike family, has very little patience for those who arrive unprepared." The sisters exchanged a confused, mocking glance before retreating to their carriage, their silks trailing in the mire. They were convinced that Prudence had finally lost her mind to the solitude of the woods, never realizing that the woman they mocked was already the architect of their displacement. The following morning, the village of Oakhaven was draped in a fine, silver mist. Prudence walked the narrow path to the office of Arthur Penhaligon, the iron-bound casket wrapped in her old wool cloak. The solicitor's office was a labyrinth of leather-bound volumes and dust-moated air, smelling of old ink and cold tea. Mr. Penhaligon sat behind his massive oak desk, surrounded by towers of unbalanced accounts. His spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose as he tallied the growing debts of Thorne Hall. The scratching of his pen was a relentless rhythm against the parchment, a dry sound that spoke of ruin and aristocratic folly. He did not look up when she entered. "I believe you are holding the wrong ledger for the Thorne estate, Mr. Penhaligon," Prudence said. She set the royal annuity ledger onto the center of his desk with a deliberate thud. The solicitor froze, the ink dripping from his nib to form a dark, spreading stain on a pile of foreclosures. He looked from the red leather book to Prudence's face, his expression shifting from professional dismissal to sharp, searching awe. "You have spent the last fortnight calculating the debts of Thorne Hall based on the vanity of my sisters," Prudence continued, her voice steady and compassionate. "Perhaps it is time you calculated the assets based on the foresight of my mother. She understood that a house is only as strong as the woman who keeps its records." Arthur Penhaligon reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the royal seal. He read the entries and the secret deed in a silence so thick it felt like the weight of history. After a long moment, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the willow branch carved into the lid of the casket. He reached into a locked mahogany drawer and produced a small sealed letter. The wax bore the same willow branch Prudence had found beneath her floorboards. "Marguerite Thorne gave me this letter on the day of your 10th birthday, madam," Penhaligon murmured, his voice thick with a rare emotion. "She instructed me that it was never to be opened unless the youngest daughter presented the royal ledger after a period of exile. She spoke of a test of character, not of blood but of bone." He broke the seal and read the final lines. A faint smile touched his lips as he looked up. "She knew your sisters would seek the surface gold. She knew only a daughter who understood the dignity of manual labor would ever think to scrub the floor of a ruin and find what was hidden beneath. By the authority of this deed and the royal annuity, you are the sole owner of the Thorne lands in perpetuity. Your sisters are currently occupying a manor that has already reverted to you by the very act of your eviction." The revelation washed over Prudence as a deep, contented quietude. The labor of the last few weeks had not been a sentence but an initiation. She gathered her things, the weight of the casket now a source of strength rather than a burden. As she returned to Willow Cottage that afternoon, the autumn sunlight turned the turning leaves to gold. She found Lord Silas Vane waiting by the gate, his tall silhouette a dark anchor against the vibrant woods. He held the silver-bound miniature frame she had restored for him, the tarnished metal now gleaming with a soft, reclaimed luster. "I went to the laundry to find you," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that resonated in the quiet clearing. "Mrs. Higgins told me I might find the mistress of the manor here, though I suspect you have always been the mistress of your own soul, Prudence." He stepped closer, his searching gaze moving from the newly laid mortar of the chimney to the meticulously repaired doorframe, reading the story of her labor in every mended seam. For a long, comfortable moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the oak branches, scattering golden leaves across the threshold. The silence between them was not the cold, oppressive quiet of Thorne Hall, but a warm, breathing stillness. It was the companionable quiet of two artisans recognizing the value of the other's craft. In that shared observation, Prudence felt an unprecedented sense of safety. He did not look at her as a nobleman looks at a newly crowned heiress, but as a man who had finally found the missing piece of a broken world. He held out the frame, his thumb tracing the repair she had made with such extreme precision. "I was told that the Thorne lands have found their rightful steward," he said, his words measured and sincere. "But I did not come for the land. I came because I have watched you rebuild a foundation from ruin, finding strength in the very stones others discarded, and I realize the only truth I wish to be a part of is found here in this quiet clearing." He took her hand, his palm rough and warm against her own. "I have no need for a duchess of the ballroom, Prudence. I have need of a partner who knows how to mend what is broken and treasure what is hidden. I ask you to bring your ledgers and your light to Oakhaven, not as a guest, but as my wife." The proposal was not a flourish of romantic theatre, but a foundational promise. Prudence looked at the man who had watched her labor in the shadows, who had seen her competence when the world saw only her rags. "I have spent 20 years learning the precise shape of being unseen," Prudence whispered, her fingers closing around his. "But it seems that in this ruin I have finally been found. The loudest truths are found in the quietest ledgers, and the restoration of a life is the work of a soul that refused to stay broken." as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the mended floorboards. Prudence knew that the architecture of her world was finally complete. The night of the sisters' victory gala at Thorne Hall arrived with a cold, biting clarity. The kind of evening where the stars seemed like distant, unfeeling chips of ice embedded in the charcoal velvet of the sky. The carriage drive was a river of golden light, illuminated by dozens of flambeaux that cast long, flickering shadows across the manicured lawns. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with the suffocating sweetness of hothouse lilies and the expensive metallic tang of French champagne. Lydia and Beatrice moved through the crowded ballroom like predators in silk, their laughter a high-pitched, practiced sound that drifted over the rhythmic sawing of the violins. They had spent the last fortnight assuming the mantle of undisputed mistresses of the county, their gowns of heavy sarcenet and Brussels lace representing a fortune they believed was settled in stone. To the local elite, they were the victors, the beautiful survivors of a family tragedy who had successfully pruned away what they considered the dead weight of their youngest sister. Lord Silas stood near the tall, velvet-draped windows of the library, his silhouette a dark, brooding anchor amidst the swirling colors of the dance. He wore the black coat of mourning with a stark, uncompromising elegance, his scarred features illuminated by the amber glow of the massive crystal chandeliers. He did not participate in the flattery or the shallow flirtations. His searching gaze was fixed on the entrance, his mind clearly lingering on the quietude of a ruin he had visited in the woods. Standing near him, Mr. Penhaligon waited with a stack of legal documents, the solicitor's spectacles reflecting the thousands of candles like tiny, frantic sparks. The sisters had intended this evening to be the announcement of their final triumph, the sealing of the estate's sale, and, they hoped, a formal alliance with the Vane name. The music was at its height, a lively quadrille that demanded the full attention of the room, when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. There was no announcement, no flourish of trumpets to signal an arrival. Instead, there was a sudden, localized drop in the temperature of the room as the cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Prudence stepped into the light of the ballroom, her simple wool cloak a stark, dark blemish against the sea of pastel silks. Her hem was stained with the mud of the Oakhaven tracks, and her hands, though clean, bore the faint red scars of the laundry's lye. She stood in the threshold for a long moment, mastering the cold, familiar mantle of being invisible even as every head in the room turned toward her. Lydia stopped mid-step, her fan snapping shut with a sound like a pistol shot. She glided toward Prudence, her lavender skirts rustling with a violent, indignant energy. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Prudence? We gave you your pittance and your ruin. To come here, dressed like a common vagrant, and disturb our guests is a public ignominy from which you shall never recover. Leave this house tonight, or I shall have the footman escort you to the gates." Beatrice followed close behind, her face twisted in a sneer of calculated cruelty. "Look at her, Lydia. She smells of the laundry and the ditch. Is this the dignity you found in your labor, sister? To beg at the doors you were cast out of?" Prudence did not flinch. She did not even look at the guests who were now whispering behind their gloved hands. She walked past her sisters, her movements carrying the steady, rhythmic grace of a woman who had spent weeks mending the bones of a house. She approached the center of the hall, where a large mahogany table held the decorative ledgers the sisters had prepared for the evening's signing. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into the folds of her cloak and produced the iron-bound casket. She set it on the table with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the cavernous room, silencing the violins and the chatter in a single decisive stroke. "I did not come to beg, Lydia," Prudence said, her voice a low, resonant silk that reached every corner of the ballroom. "I came to return what was hidden, and to claim what was never yours to take." She opened the lid of the casket, and the light from the chandeliers seemed to congregate in the center of the table. The Thorne diamonds spilled out over the dark wood, a cascade of cold, brilliant fire that made the sisters' own jewelry look like dull glass. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, a wave of awe that broke the social ice of the evening. But Prudence did not stop there. She laid the royal annuity ledger on the table, the red leather and gold embossing a symbol of a law that predated the sisters' greed. Next to the volume, she placed the secret deed, the wax seal of the High Court still vibrant and red. Mr. Penhaligon stepped forward then, his role as the impartial witness finally finding its voice. "I have spent the afternoon verifying these documents, ladies and gentlemen," the solicitor announced, his voice dry and authoritative. The late Marguerite Thorne established a trust that is irrevocable. The ownership of Thorne Hall is legally tethered to the stewardship of Willow Cottage. By evicting their sister and seeking to sell that parcel, Lydia and Beatrice Thorne have triggered a reversion clause that was designed to protect the integrity of the estate. They have, by their own actions, disinherited themselves. The silence that followed was the exact temperature of a frozen pond. Lydia's face went from a flush of anger to a deathly chalky white, the sarcenet of her gown suddenly looking like a shroud. She reached out to touch the ledger, her fingers trembling, but Silas stepped between her and the table. He did not speak to her. His gaze was fixed on Prudence, his expression one of profound, quiet vindication. "The bones of this house are not made of gold or silk, Lydia," Prudence said, looking her sister in the eye with a terrifying clarity. "They are made of the labor and the foresight of a mother you chose to ignore. You sought the surface, and in doing so, you have lost the foundation. You will leave Thorne Hall tonight. The cart that brought me to the ruin is waiting at the portico. I suggest you take only what can fit in a single trunk." The weight of their own mockery seemed to settle upon their shoulders, dragging at the stiff sarcenet of their gowns as they stood exposed. In front of the very people they had sought to impress, they were stripped of their borrowed majesty. Beatrice released a sharp, strangled intake of breath, her face crumpling as the silence of the room turned into a cold, judging weight. They were forced to walk the length of the hall, the guests parting for them in a silence that was colder than any winter wind. Prudence watched them go, not with malice, but with the quiet observation of a restorer who had finally removed the rot from a beautiful structure. A fortnight later, the transition of Thorne Hall was complete. The hothouse lilies had been removed, and the air in the grand hallways once again smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the clean scent of wood smoke. Prudence stood on the portico of the manor, her simple black dress a mark of a dignity that required no flattery. Near her, Lord Silas watched as the final cart departed for the eastern borders of the estate. It was a small open cart, carrying the few personal effects the sisters were permitted to keep. Lydia and Beatrice sat in the back, their expensive silks replaced by the practical wool of the displaced, their faces obscured by the shadows of their own undoing. They were moving into Willow Cottage, the very ruin they had once mocked as a grave. Prudence had mended the roof, stabilized the rafters, and scrubbed the floorboards until they shone, providing them with a sanctuary that was far better than they deserved. They would learn the dignity of manual labor, or they would perish in the coldness of their own vanity. The choice was now theirs. The moral legacy that Marguerite Thorne had planned with the precision of a master bookbinder was finally manifest, ensuring that the lifeline she hid would become the anchor of the family's truth. Lord Silas reached out and took Prudence's hand, his palm rough and warm against her own. "The cottage is closed, Prudence. The floorboards are mended, and the secret is out in the light. This house is no longer a monument to silence." She looked out over the rolling hills of the Oakhaven valley, her heart a calm, steady drumbeat. She thought of the iron-bound casket and the silver frame she had restored, the physical artifacts of a life that had been mended by her own hands. She thought of the path she had walked, and how the architecture of her world was, finally and beautifully, complete. "I shall listen for the water, not the wheel, Silas," she murmured, her gaze meeting his with a soft, foundational hope. The restoration of a house is a finite task, but the restoration of a name is the work of a soul that has finally found its home. She took the heavy iron key to Willow Cottage from her pocket and turned it in the lock of the manor's great door. The sound a definitive, musical snap that signaled the end of her exile. She did not look back at the ruin in the woods. She walked into the warmth of the hall, the shadows of the past replaced by the amber light of a future she had built, with her own competence and her mother's hidden love. She had spent a lifetime navigating the hollow spaces of a house that did not want her. Now, standing in the amber warmth of a home she had earned, she was finally, undeniably, its cornerstone. True love is being fully witnessed in one's simplest state, and justice is not always a gavel. Sometimes, it is the sound of a key turning in a lock that was always yours. The mending of a soul is a slow, tactile process, but it is the only work that truly endures. Have you ever found the peace of being truly seen after a lifetime of being ignored? Tell me, from which corner of the world are you currently mending the ruins of your own life? Share your story with me below.